A heavy chest of drawers slid across a child's bedroom floor with no one near it. This single event launched the Enfield Poltergeist, one of history's most famous and fiercely debated paranormal cases. For 2 years, a modest London home became a battleground between the impossible and the explainable. Was it a genuine haunting, an elaborate trick, or something even stranger? By the end of this journey, you will have all the evidence to decide for yourself. We will unpack the chilling voice of a dead man, examine a photograph of a levitating girl, and confront the skeptics' best arguments. How do you explain a mystery that convinced police officers and hardened investigators, yet still feels just out of reach? August 1977 in Enfield, North London was like any other late summer. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass and the distant hum of traffic, a quiet suburb where nothing much ever happened. Inside number 284 Green Street, a modest, semi-detached council house, lived a family who perfectly fit that description. Peggy Hodgson, a single mother, worked hard to provide for her 4 children. There was 13-year-old Margaret, the eldest, 11-year-old Janet, 10-year-old Johnny, and 7-year-old Billy. Their home was simple, filled with the ordinary clutter of childhood, and their lives revolved around school, friends, and making ends meet. They were a working-class family, grounded and practical, with no interest in ghosts or spooky stories. The supernatural was the stuff of late-night movies, not something that could ever touch their reality. This very ordinariness is what makes what happened next so difficult to explain. When your world is built on school uniforms and grocery bills, you do not have a blueprint for the impossible. The peace of that ordinary home shattered on the night of August 30th. It began with a sound, a low, rhythmic knocking from the wall behind the girls' beds. Janet and Margaret, trying to sleep, dismissed it at first, but the knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to shake the very room. Then came the movement. In the dim light, they saw their heavy chest of drawers begin to shudder, its wooden feet scraping against the floorboards before it slid, all on its own, a full 4 inches. That was enough. The 2 sisters scrambled from their beds and bolted down the hallway, bursting into their mother's room in a blind panic. They were hysterical, struggling to explain the impossible. Furniture was moving by itself. Their room was alive. Peggy Hodgson, a woman of deep practical sense, did what any parent would do. She tried to calm them, assuming it was a nightmare or a childish prank. But the look of raw terror in their eyes was undeniable. She walked back with them to their room, expecting to find everything perfectly still. Instead, she witnessed it herself. The heavy chest of drawers, a solid piece of furniture that took real effort to move, was shifting. It slid again with a slow, grinding purpose across the floor. This was no trick of the light. This was a physical defiance of every law she understood. The air in the room turned cold, thick with a dread that had no logical source. Her own fear, a primal, gut-level response, confirmed her daughter's story. Something was very wrong. Her first instinct was to call for help from the only authority she could think of. She phoned the police. When the officers arrived, they entered a house charged with palpable tension. They listened patiently to the family's frantic account, their professional skepticism a quiet shield. They checked the room, the furniture, the windows. They found nothing out of place, no sign of forced entry, no logical explanation for the heavy chest's movement. But as they stood there, preparing to leave and file a report about a frightened family, it happened once more. The officers watched, their own composure cracking, as a chair in the corner of the girls' room slid across the floor without a single hand touching it. One of the policemen later stated in official reports that he saw the chair move. In that moment, the Enfield case ceased to be a private family fright. It became an official mystery with a police report number attached, drawing a line from a terrified household into the wider world of investigation. The haunting had its first witnesses in uniform, and there was no turning back. The officer who answered that call was Police Constable Carolyn Heaps. She arrived at the Hodgson house expecting a routine disturbance, perhaps a domestic argument or a noise complaint. What she found was a family huddled together, their faces pale with a fear that seemed to vibrate through the quiet home. She listened to their story with professional detachment, the kind bred from seeing all manner of urban troubles. A moving chest of drawers, it sounded like the product of overactive imaginations, perhaps a prank that had gone too far. Her job was to assess the situation, provide reassurance, and file a report. She conducted a thorough check of the premises, looking for signs of an intruder or any logical cause for the disturbance. She found nothing. The house was secure, the family was clearly distressed, and there was no evidence to support their extraordinary claim. As she stood in the girl's bedroom with Peggy and the children, preparing to conclude her visit, the ordinary world in that room simply stopped making sense. A lightweight plastic chair, the kind you might find in any kitchen, sat in the corner. Without a sound, without a tremor, it began to slide smoothly across the floor. Police Constable Heaps watched, her training and skepticism utterly useless as the chair traveled, in her own measured words, about 3 to 4 feet. It moved with a calm, deliberate motion that defied every physical law she knew. There was no string, no magnet, no hidden mechanism she could detect. In her official report, she stated plainly, "I saw the chair move." That simple, factual sentence from a sworn officer of the law changed everything. It was no longer just a family's strange story. It was an observed event documented by the state. A police witness provided an anchor of credibility in a sea of the unbelievable. Suddenly, the Enfield case had a foundation built not on rumor or fear, but on a cool, professional observation. If a trained police officer could see it, then the phenomenon was undeniably real in some form. The question was no longer if something happened, but what on earth could possibly be causing it. The chair sliding for the police was merely a quiet opening act. What followed was a relentless siege that transformed the Hodgson home into a theater of the absurd and terrifying. The phenomena did not just continue, it evolved, multiplying in both frequency and violence with each passing day. The initial eerie knocks in the walls gave way to a cacophony of unexplained sounds, a constant soundtrack of bangs, thumps, and scrapes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Objects took on a life of their own. Small, innocuous things like marbles and Lego bricks would suddenly fly across a room as if hurled by an invisible, petulant child. Peggy Hodgson would find herself ducking as a cup or a saucer sailed past her head in the kitchen, shattering against the wall. On one chilling occasion, a pot of freshly made tea was reportedly lifted from the stove and thrown, scalding liquid and ceramic spraying across the floor. The family's beds would shake violently in the middle of the night, as if gripped by an earthquake contained solely within their frames. Perhaps most unnerving were the cold spots, sudden pockets of icy air that would form in the middle of a warm room, causing the breath to fog and skin to prickle with goosebumps. This was no longer a single ghostly prank, it was a full repertoire of disruption. The atmosphere in the house became thick with a constant, low-grade dread. The family lived in a state of hyper-vigilance, never knowing where the next attack would come from or what form it would take. Sleep was nearly impossible, meals were interrupted, and the simple act of walking from one room to another felt like crossing a battlefield. The poltergeist was not just present, it was oppressive, a malicious force that seemed dedicated to eroding their sense of safety and sanity, brick by psychic brick. The chaos inside number 284 Green Street was about to spill out onto the front pages. As word of the police report and the escalating disturbances spread, the quiet suburban street transformed into a media circus. Reporters and photographers from every major newspaper in Britain descended, camping on the pavement outside the Hodgson home. Their long-lens cameras were perpetually trained on the front door, waiting to capture any sign of the family or, they hoped, a ghostly face in the window. The Hodgson's private trauma became a public spectacle, a daily source of sensational headlines. For the press, it was a perfect storm, a real-life ghost story with a photogenic family at its heart. They dubbed it the Enfield Poltergeist, a name that would echo for decades, but this attention was a double-edged sword. While some coverage presented the family's ordeal with sympathy, a strong skeptical narrative emerged almost immediately. Influential papers, particularly those with a more rationalist slant, began to frame the story differently. They suggested it was an elaborate hoax, a clever prank orchestrated by the children, perhaps as a cry for attention from a single-parent household. Headlines questioned the family's motives and the validity of the phenomena. This media pressure created an impossible environment for the family. They were simultaneously under siege from an unseen force inside their home and under a microscope of public doubt outside of it. Every time they stepped out for groceries, they faced a barrage of questions and flashing bulbs. Every strange sound from within the house was now potentially a performance for an audience. This relentless scrutiny fundamentally complicated any serious investigation. How could anyone, including the family themselves, distinguish between genuine paranormal events and the natural, heightened behavior that comes from living in a fishbowl? The media's presence didn't just report on the mystery, it became an active ingredient in it, shaping perceptions and eroding the family's credibility before any official experts had even arrived to form their own conclusions. Into this storm of noise and doubt stepped an organization uniquely equipped to bring order. The Society for Psychical Research, or SPR, was founded in the late 19th century with a singular, serious mission: to investigate paranormal phenomena using scientific methods. They were not ghost hunters, they were investigators, often academics and professionals who approached the unexplainable with a toolkit of skepticism and rigor. When word of Enfield reached them, they knew they had to intervene. The case was too public, too persistent, and too laden with conflicting accounts to ignore. Their involvement marked a critical turning point, shifting the story from tabloid sensation to a documented field study. The society dispatched two men who would become central figures in the entire saga, and whose opposing perspectives would frame the debate for decades. The first to arrive was Maurice Grosse. He was not a career academic but a successful inventor and businessman whose life had been shattered by personal tragedy. His daughter, Janet, had died in a motorcycle accident not long before. Grieving and searching for meaning, he had joined the SPR, driven by a profound personal question: was there something beyond death? When he walked into the Hodgson home, he brought not just a tape recorder and a notepad, but a deep, empathetic need to believe. He connected immediately with the family, especially the children, offering a steady, paternal presence amidst the chaos. He was their champion, a believer who took their fear seriously. His counterpart was Dr. John Beloff, a respected psychologist from the University of Edinburgh and a noted skeptic within the SPR. Beloff's role was to be the critical eye, the one who looked for normal explanations before accepting supernatural ones. He was there to test the phenomena, to search for signs of fraud, and to apply psychological scrutiny to the family's claims. Together, Grosse and Beloff represented the two essential halves of a proper investigation: open-minded curiosity and rigorous doubt. Their methodology was methodical. They set up equipment throughout the house, including cameras with film, not for live broadcast but to capture unexpected moments. They installed audio recorders to run for hours, hoping to catch the mysterious knocking sounds or disembodied voices. They conducted lengthy, separate interviews with each family member, looking for inconsistencies in their stories. They placed objects in controlled environments, marking their positions to see if they moved when no one was looking. They even conducted simple tests, asking the supposed entity to make a sound on command or to move a specific item. For weeks, the investigators lived alongside the family, observing the phenomena firsthand. They heard the knocks, felt the cold spots, and saw objects move. Maurice Gross's tapes captured some of the most chilling audio evidence ever recorded, including the deep, rasping voice that would soon become the infamous centerpiece of the entire case. But Dr. Beloff remained cautious, his scientific training urging him to consider all possibilities, no matter how mundane. The stage was now set for a collision between two worlds, the empathetic search for proof of survival and the clinical search for a human trick. The evidence was about to get a lot stranger and a lot more personal. The investigation's turning point arrived not with a moving chair but with a voice. It began subtly, a low, guttural rasp that seemed to catch in 11-year-old Janet Hodgson's throat. She would be in the middle of a sentence or lying in bed when her own voice would distort, dropping into a register that was impossibly deep and rough for a young girl. This was no longer just knocks and flying objects, this was a personality, and it claimed a name, Bill. The voice stated it was Bill Wilkins, a man who had lived and died in the house years before the Hodgsons moved in. When Maurice Gross first captured this voice on his reel-to-reel tape recorder, the atmosphere in the room shifted from eerie to profoundly unsettling. The audio clip, which you can hear now, is chilling in its raw, unvarnished strangeness. It is not the melodramatic groan of a movie ghost, but a dry, crackling, aged-sounding voice that seems to struggle to form words. It sounds like a man who has not spoken in decades, his vocal cords rusted shut. This recording became the infamous centerpiece of the entire Enfield case, a piece of evidence you can listen to and judge for yourself. So what could possibly explain it? The theories split into three distinct camps, each with profound implications. The first and most extraordinary is the paranormal claim that this was genuine possession or direct vocal channeling. The voice displayed knowledge a child like Janet supposedly could not have known, mentioning details about Bill Wilkins' life, like the fact he died of a hemorrhage in a downstairs chair, blind and unable to reach the door. Investigators would later verify many of these details, adding a layer of credibility that stunned even the skeptics. The second theory is the skeptical counterpunch, that this was an astonishing feat of prolonged ventriloquism and acting by an 11-year-old girl. Could Janet have somehow taught herself to throw her voice into such a convincing, sustained character, fooling her family, investigators, and audio experts for months on end? The third theory sits in a murkier middle ground, suggesting a psychological phenomenon, perhaps a form of dissociative identity triggered by the intense stress and attention, where Janet unconsciously created the Bill persona as a conduit for the chaos. The voice's content itself was a bizarre mix. It could be crude and abusive, snarling insults at the investigators and the family, but it could also be oddly specific and strangely mournful, speaking of loneliness and the confusion of death. It would answer questions, sometimes correctly, sometimes evasively, and even hold conversations. This was no longer a simple poltergeist throwing pots. It was an intelligence or the masterful illusion of one. The voice of Bill forced everyone involved to confront the very limits of what they believed possible. Was it the key to proving life after death, or simply the most elaborate part of an unimaginably complex hoax? The answer depended entirely on who you asked and what they were willing to believe. Among all the strange sounds and moving objects, one event stood out for its sheer visual impossibility. Maurice Gross, the investigator who had become a near-permanent resident in the Hodgson home, claimed to have witnessed something that defied not just explanation but gravity itself. He described a night where Janet, lying in her bed, was suddenly and silently lifted into the air. According to his detailed account, he saw her body rise, hover for several seconds above the mattress, and then float laterally across the room before being dropped back onto the bed. This was not a subtle levitation but a full, controlled flight. The story alone would have been extraordinary, but it was given a powerful, tangible anchor by a single, grainy black and white photograph. The image shows Janet lying on her side on her bed, but her body appears suspended with a noticeable gap of empty space between her back and the mattress. Her posture seems unnatural, as if supported by nothing at all. For believers, this photograph became the smoking gun, the concrete visual proof that the phenomena were undeniably real and physical. How could a child fake such a thing in front of an experienced investigator, they argued, and how could a simple camera capture such a perfect illusion? The photograph seemed to freeze a moment of pure paranormal physics, a snapshot of the impossible made real. Skeptics, however, immediately trained their scrutiny on this iconic image. They proposed several rational explanations that, while requiring some coincidence, fit within the known world. The most common argument revolves around a trick of perspective and timing. They suggest Janet might have been in the middle of a sudden, convulsive movement, perhaps sitting up or twisting in bed, and the camera's slow shutter speed in the low light created a motion blur that made her appear suspended. Another theory points to the bedding itself. The rumpled blankets and sheets could have created shadows and folds that, in a poor quality photograph, visually merged with her nightgown, eliminating the appearance of contact with the mattress. Some even proposed a simple, if daring, prank, that Janet had learned to arch her back with hidden support from her arms in a way that created the illusion of levitation for a brief moment, a moment Maurice Grosse happened to witness and a photographer happened to capture. These explanations hinge on the idea of a perfect storm, a misinterpretation of an ordinary event viewed through the lens of expectation and fear. For the skeptics, the photograph is not evidence of the paranormal, but evidence of how easily our perceptions can be fooled, especially when we are already primed to see a miracle. The implications of this single event, if accepted as genuine, ripple out to touch the very foundations of science and human experience. Psychologically, it would mean that Janet Hodgson was not just a channel for noises or a voice, but a focal point for a force with tangible, physical power over matter. It would suggest a consciousness, whether her own or an attached entity, capable of directly manipulating the fundamental force of gravity, an ability beyond any known human or natural capacity. Physically, it challenges everything we understand about mass, energy, and the laws of motion. Levitation is not just a party trick, it is a direct violation of the principle that an object at rest stays at rest unless acted upon by an external force. What was that force? Where did the energy come from? If Janet was truly levitated, then the Enfield case was not merely a haunting, it was a laboratory for a physics we do not yet comprehend. This pushes the mystery beyond ghosts and into the realm of undiscovered natural phenomena, perhaps a form of psychokinesis so powerful it could lift a human body. The levitation, therefore, sits at the absolute peak of the Enfield claims. To believe it is to accept that the world contains possibilities far stranger than any ghost story. To doubt it is to see a frightened girl and a man who wanted desperately to believe, their combined testimony frozen in a photograph that promises everything but proves nothing. This single image, more than any voice recording or flying toy, draws the line in the sand. On which side do you find yourself? But if the voice and the levitation were real, how do we explain the skeptics who dismantled the case piece by piece? Their most powerful weapon was not a scientific instrument, but a name: David Robertson. This was the man, according to a compelling counter-narrative, who orchestrated the entire spectacle from the shadows. The theory, championed most notably by researcher and author Melvin Harris, paints a very different picture of the Enfield Poltergeist. It suggests the haunting was not supernatural, but a brilliantly executed performance, a magic trick on a grand scale. And at the center of it all was a neighbor, a family friend with a peculiar hobby. David Robertson lived nearby and was known to the Hodgson children. He was also, crucially, an amateur magician with a deep fascination for the supernatural. skeptics argue that Robertson saw an opportunity in the family's initial, genuine fright over the moving furniture. They propose he began to visit the house not as a concerned friend but as a director, quietly coaching the two girls, Janet and Margaret, on how to escalate the phenomena. He could have taught them simple tricks, the kind of illusions a clever child could master, how to throw their voice to create the rasping Bill persona, how to secretly manipulate objects with hidden threads or wires when no one was looking, even how to contort their bodies to simulate a levitation for a fleeting second. The motive, perhaps it was a complex prank that spiraled out of control, or a desire to create a real-life ghost story for his own amusement. The feasibility of such a long-term deception is the theory's greatest hurdle, yet also its central argument. Could two young girls, under the guidance of an amateur magician, really fool their own mother, police officers, and teams of investigators for nearly 2 years? Skeptics point to the history of famous hoaxes where determined individuals have sustained elaborate lies for far longer under intense scrutiny. They argue that children are particularly adept at lying when they feel it brings them attention or protects a secret. Every piece of evidence, from the moving chairs to the chilling voice recordings, is reinterpreted through this lens. The voice of Bill is not a spirit but a talented act of ventriloquism. The levitation photo is a captured moment of clever physical staging. The knowledge of the dead man's life could have been gleaned from local gossip or old records, then fed to the girls to recite. This theory turns the entire case into a human drama of manipulation and collusion, a story not of ghosts but of a very earthly desire to believe in them, exploited by someone who knew how to make the impossible seem real. It is a clean, rational explanation that sweeps away the supernatural clutter. But to accept it, you must believe in something almost as extraordinary as a ghost, the flawless, long-term conspiracy of two children and a neighborhood magician, a performance so convincing it etched itself into history. The case for a hoax found its most compelling physical evidence not in a voice recording, but in a simple piece of cutlery. During the height of the media frenzy, a reporter from a skeptical newspaper was visiting the Hodgson home. As he walked through the living room, he claims he saw a spoon suddenly fly through the air and land on the floor. When he picked it up, he discovered it was dramatically bent, as if by an invisible, powerful force. For critics, this was a smoking gun. They argued the spoon had been pre-bent, a classic magician's prop, and had been planted or thrown by one of the children to create a moment of false evidence for the visiting journalist. It was a stunt, they said, and a clumsy one at that, revealing the human hands behind the supposed supernatural chaos. This incident was not alone. Other investigators and visitors reported moments that broke the spell. There were accounts of Janet being glimpsed just for a second, apparently throwing a small object before a loud bang was heard. On a few occasions, the mysterious knocking sounds seemed to follow a predictable pattern, almost as if someone was creating them by tapping discreetly on a wall or piece of furniture. These were the cracks in the facade, the moments when the meticulously maintained illusion of a haunting seemed to slip, revealing the possibility of ordinary trickery. So, what do these alleged catches truly mean for the entire Enfield story? The answer depends on the weight you give them. For the staunch skeptic, these incidents are not exceptions, they are the key. They prove that fraud was not only possible but actively occurring. If Janet was caught throwing one object, the logic follows, then she could have thrown them all. If a spoon was planted, then the levitation could have been staged, and the voice could have been an act. These moments dismantle the entire case, reducing 2 years of terror to a long-running game that fooled grieving fathers and overwhelmed police officers. This perspective demands we see the haunting as a binary choice, either entirely real or entirely fake. But the other side of the argument offers a more complex and perhaps more unsettling possibility. What if the haunting was real and the hoaxes were part of it? Consider the psychological pressure on those children. They were living in a house under siege, with investigators constantly testing them, reporters watching their every move, and an entire nation questioning their honesty. Is it so hard to believe that, at times, they might have felt compelled to perform? If the phenomena were inconsistent, maybe they worried the adults would lose interest or think they were lying. They might have supplemented the real, unpredictable events with a few staged ones, just to keep the story alive, to validate their own terrifying reality. In this view, the bent spoon and the thrown object are not proof the whole thing was a lie, but tragic evidence of children trapped in an impossible situation, trying to prove the unbelievable was happening to them. They become symptoms of the haunting, not its cause. This interpretation forces us to sit with a profound ambiguity. The Enfield Poltergeist might not be a clean puzzle with a single solution. It could be a tangled knot of the genuine and the manufactured, where real fear and unexplained events coexisted with childish mischief and a desperate need to be believed. The truth, then, might not be found in choosing one side over the other, but in holding both possibilities in tension, in that unsettling gray area where the most enduring mysteries always reside. The bent spoon could be explained away, but some physical traces left no room for sleight of hand. On a quiet afternoon, with investigators present in the house, Peggy Hodgson walked into her kitchen and stopped cold. There, leading from the back door across the linoleum floor, was a trail of fresh, wet footprints. They were small, barefoot, and glistening under the electric light. The immediate assumption was that one of the children had run in from the garden. Yet a quick check revealed all 4 children were accounted for in the living room, their feet completely dry. No one had come in from outside. The back door was locked. Maurice Gross was summoned, and he arrived with his camera. He documented the prints meticulously, photographing their clear outline and the way the water beaded on the floor's surface. This was not a fleeting sound or a thrown object lost to motion blur. This was a tangible, lasting mark. The investigators did what they were trained to do. They ruled out the obvious. They checked for leaks from the ceiling or walls. There were none. They examined the children's feet again, confirming no moisture. They even tested whether someone could have secretly carried a wet cloth to stamp the prints, but the pattern and pressure of the steps, the natural splay of toes captured in the water, seemed authentic. The prints simply existed, a silent, physical contradiction in the middle of a sunlit room. This evidence stands apart from the voice or the flying toys. A child can throw her voice or sneak a bend into a spoon. But how do 2 young girls secretly manufacture a trail of wet footprints in a busy household, under the occasional but real surveillance of adults, without leaving a single trace of a water source or wet feet on themselves? The logistics of such a prank become staggeringly complex. It would require planning, timing, and a flawless cleanup of any tools, all while maintaining the illusion of fear and surprise. The footprints present a different category of phenomenon, one that feels less like a performance and more like a spontaneous, physical intrusion from an unseen world. They are a stubborn piece of the puzzle that refuses to fit neatly into the box labeled Hoax, a small, damp mystery that suggests something or someone was truly walking through that house. The wet footprints were a quiet anomaly, but the flying objects were a constant, violent assault. This was the poltergeist's signature act, a relentless barrage that turned the Hodgson home into a domestic war zone. Objects did not just slide, they were launched, often with startling force and impossible trajectories. Investigators documented toys, kitchen utensils, and even furniture moving through the air in clear, high parabolic arcs, as if thrown by an invisible pitcher. On one occasion, a heavy fireplace grate was reported to have flown across the living room. On another, a large toy car sailed down the staircase in a perfect curve, landing with a crash in the hallway. These were not gentle nudges, they were projectiles. The force involved presents a serious physical puzzle. To propel an object like a Lego brick or a marble in a high arc requires a specific combination of strength, angle, and intent. A child faking such an event would need to secretly throw the item with enough power to mimic a supernatural launch, yet do so without the telltale wind-up of a human arm and almost never get seen in the act. The consistency of these reports over 2 years adds another layer of complexity. How could 2 young girls, under near constant observation from their mother, police, and teams of investigators, orchestrate hundreds, if not thousands, of such throws without a single definitive, undeniable capture? The investigators were not passive observers, they were actively trying to catch a fraud. Maurice Grosse and others would sit for hours in quiet rooms, their eyes scanning for any movement, their ears tuned for the slightest shuffle of fabric that might betray a hidden hand. They set up controlled environments, marking object positions and sealing off rooms. Yet the phenomena persisted, often erupting in the very room where an investigator sat alone, having just confirmed no one else was present. A chair would tip over in a corner, a book would slide from a shelf, a pot would rattle on the stove, all while the adult in the room stared directly at the spot, seeing nothing but the object itself in motion. These empty room incidents are among the most challenging to explain away. If the girls were the sole agents behind the chaos, it would require a level of stealth, timing, and physical skill that borders on the superhuman itself. They would have needed to move with absolute silence, create convincing trajectories from concealed positions, and predict the exact moments an investigator would look away, not just once but repeatedly for years. Consider the simple act of throwing a marble to make it appear from nowhere. To fake it, a child would need to hide the marble in her hand, wait for the perfect second when every adult eye was distracted, then throw it with a force that didn't match a hidden, cramped motion, and immediately resume a posture of innocent fear, all without a trace of guilt or exertion on her face. Now imagine doing that several times a day, every day, under extreme stress without ever slipping up. The logistical burden of such a sustained deception is in its own way as incredible as the idea of a poltergeist. This leaves us with a troubling either-or scenario. Either 2 children executed a flawless, physically demanding performance that fooled everyone for an impossibly long time, or the objects in that house were moving by a means we still do not understand. The force behind the throws remains a ghost in the machine, a silent question hanging in the air long after the last object fell. Perhaps the most unsettling explanation lies not in a ghost but within the human mind itself. For decades, parapsychologists have studied a phenomenon known as recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, or RSPK. This is the idea that intense emotional stress, often in a young person, can unconsciously generate a form of mind-over-matter energy. Think of it not as a haunting by a dead spirit, but as a haunting by a living person's own turbulent psyche. The energy of their unspoken anger, their fear, their confusion, somehow spills out into the physical world, moving objects, creating sounds, and manifesting chaos without their conscious intent. It is a psychic pressure valve blowing open. In the Enfield case, this theory centers squarely on Janet Hodgson. She was 11 years old when it began, right at the cusp of adolescence, a time of immense physical and emotional change. Her family structure was under strain, a single mother working hard to make ends meet in a small, crowded house. The stress was a quiet, constant hum in the background of her life. Could all that bottled-up energy have found an impossible outlet? If RSPK is real, then Janet was not a fraudster or a passive victim of a ghost, but an unwitting psychic powerhouse. The phenomena were real, the objects truly moved, but the force behind them was her own subconscious mind. This reframes every strange event. The violent throwing of objects becomes an externalization of inner rage or frustration she could not express. The deep, rasping voice of Bill Wilkins might not be a separate entity, but a dissociative personality created by her mind to act out, a character to shoulder the blame for the chaos her own psyche was creating. Even the infamous levitation could be seen as a symbolic act, a desperate, unconscious wish to escape the unbearable pressure of her reality. This theory provides a compelling middle ground. It accepts the physical reality of the events witnessed by police and investigators, sidestepping the need for a grand conspiracy. It also explains why the phenomena were so centered on the home and so tied to Janet's presence. Yet, it introduces a mystery far more profound than any ghost. How does a thought, a feeling, become a physical force? Science has no mechanism for this, no way to measure the energy of emotion or explain how it could bend a spoon or lift a child. RSPK asks us to consider a universe where the mind is not just a prisoner of physics, but can sometimes, under extreme duress, become its master. It turns the Enfield Poltergeist from a story about a haunted house into a story about a haunted girl, whose inner turmoil became so vast it literally shook the walls of her world. The theory of a psychic pressure valve only works if there was genuine pressure to release. So what was life really like inside that house before the first chair slid? Peggy Hodgson was a single mother in 1970s Britain, a role that carried its own unique weight of social judgment and practical hardship. Her husband had left years earlier, and she bore the full burden of providing for 4 growing children on a modest income. The financial strain was a constant, low-grade hum in the background of their lives, a worry about bills, about groceries, about keeping the lights on in that very semi-detached house on Green Street. The home was small, crowded with the energy and clutter of 2 teenagers and 2 younger children, a pressure cooker of developing personalities and limited private space. For the children, particularly Janet at 11 and her sister Margaret at 13, this environment was their entire world. Adolescence is a turbulent time for anyone, a storm of hormonal changes, social anxieties, and a desperate search for identity. Now layer on top of that the stress of a fractured family, the unspoken worry of a struggling mother, and the cramped quarters where every argument and every quiet sadness echoed off the walls. It was a perfect recipe for profound, internalized stress. Psychologists who have studied the case often point to this backdrop not as proof of a hoax, but as fertile ground for extraordinary psychological phenomena. They discuss concepts like conversion disorder, where intense emotional distress converts into physical symptoms with no medical cause, or mass psychogenic illness, where stress spreads through a group and manifests in shared physical experiences. Could a poltergeist be a form of conversion disorder for an entire household, where the family's collective anxiety didn't produce a rash or a headache, but instead produced flying marbles and knocking walls? The phenomena in this light become a bizarre language, a desperate physical cry for help from a family system under immense strain. The violent throwing of objects could mirror unexpressed anger. The invasive, abusive voice of Bill might channel the children's own confusion and fear, giving it a name and a face outside of themselves. Even the attention from investigators and the press, while overwhelming, provided a dramatic break from the monotony of their struggle, a chaotic validation that their lives were suddenly important. This perspective doesn't accuse the family of lying, it empathizes with their suffering. It suggests they were telling the truth about their experiences because they were truly experiencing them. The movements, the sounds, the cold spots, all were real to their senses. The source, however, may have been the incredible, untapped power of a mind or a group of minds pushed to its breaking point. The house wasn't haunted by a ghost, it was haunted by the silent, screaming stress of the people living inside it, a turmoil so deep it learned to move the furniture. Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair did not arrive at the Hodgson home as wide-eyed believers. They were seasoned investigators, men trained to question everything. Yet after months of direct daily exposure to the phenomena, both reached a startlingly firm conclusion. They believed the haunting was real. Their conviction was not born from a single event, but from a crushing weight of cumulative evidence, a relentless barrage of the inexplicable that wore down their professional skepticism. Gross, the grieving father searching for a sign from beyond, and Playfair, the pragmatic researcher, found themselves on the same side of a profound divide. Their journey from curiosity to certainty is the backbone of the believer's case. Maurice Gross was the first to commit. He spent more nights in that house than almost anyone outside the family, his tape recorder constantly rolling. He wasn't just listening for ghosts, he was building a relationship with the Hodgson children, especially Janet. He saw their fear up close, the exhaustion in their eyes, the flinch at an unexpected sound. For him, the sheer duration and variety of the phenomena argued against fraud. How could children maintain such an elaborate act day after day, month after month, under his constant, watchful presence? He documented hundreds of incidents, many when he was the sole adult in the room. He heard the knocks answer questions in a simple code. He felt the temperature plummet for no reason. He witnessed objects move in ways that defied simple physics, not with a dramatic flourish, but with a slow, eerie purpose that felt utterly alien. For Gross, the clincher was often the human element, the spontaneous, unscripted reactions of terror or confusion that he felt no child could fake so consistently. Guy Lyon Playfair, an author and member of the Society for Psychical Research, arrived later but dove in with equal intensity. He brought a more systematic, analytical mind to the investigation. He set up experiments, attempted to communicate directly with the intelligence behind the events, and meticulously logged every occurrence. Playfair was particularly struck by the physicality of it all. He described how heavy furniture would shift, not with a sudden jerk, but with a smooth, sliding motion that seemed to require a sustained force, something very difficult for a child to produce secretly. He noted the intelligence behind some of the phenomena, like objects being moved to specific, sometimes symbolic locations, or responses that displayed a crude, mocking wit. After 14 months of intensive investigation, Playfair reached his own firm verdict. He channeled this conviction into his book, This House is Haunted, published in 1980. It remains the definitive, first-hand account from inside the believer's camp. The book is not a sensational ghost story, but a detailed, chronological record of events, filled with times, dates, witness statements, and photographs. Playfair presented it as a case file, a dossier of evidence for the prosecution in the trial against a purely material world. For him, the collective testimony of police officers, journalists, and fellow investigators, combined with his own direct observations, formed an argument too substantial to dismiss. He wrote not to convince the hardened skeptic, but to document what he and others had witnessed, to state plainly that in that ordinary house on Green Street, the rules of reality as we know them had for a time been convincingly broken. Their belief forces a critical question. If two intelligent, experienced men, actively searching for signs of fraud, could become so utterly convinced of the paranormal nature of these events, what does that say about the evidence they gathered? Were they fooled by masterful child actors, or were they privileged witnesses to something truly beyond our understanding? The answer lies in the details they left behind, details that would soon be picked apart by their most formidable opponent. But for every believer like Gross and Playfair, there was a skeptic armed with a different kind of evidence. The most formidable of these was perhaps psychologist Anita Gregory. While Maurice Gross saw a grieving spirit in the voice of Bill, Anita Gregory saw a textbook case of child psychology in action. Her investigation, conducted separately for the Society for Psychical Research, focused not on capturing phenomena, but on deconstructing the family dynamic. She spent considerable time with the Hodgson children, observing their interactions and listening to their stories with a clinician's ear. What she reported was a pattern that, to her, pointed away from the supernatural and toward a very human origin. Gregory documented moments where the children's accounts of events would shift or grow more dramatic when they were together, suggesting a process of mutual reinforcement. She noted how the phenomena often coincided with times of boredom or when adult attention was waning, almost as if the haunting was a tool to regain the spotlight. Most damningly, she compiled statements from school friends and neighbors who claimed the girls had privately confessed to faking some of the events, moving objects with their feet or throwing things when no one was looking. For Gregory, the Enfield Poltergeist was not a paranormal event, but a complex social and psychological one. She theorized that the initial, unexplained fright over the moving furniture created a powerful narrative. This narrative then gave the children, particularly Janet, a unique and compelling role. In a crowded, stressed household, being the focus of a world-famous mystery brought a form of inverted celebrity. The investigators, the reporters, the constant stream of concerned adults all revolved around them. Gregory argued that the children, perhaps without even fully realizing it, began to sustain the story, adding new details and stunts to keep the fascinating chaos alive. Her conclusion was clear: the case was a mixture of childhood fantasy, unconscious manipulation, and outright fraud, amplified by investigators who desperately wanted to believe. This perspective does not necessarily cast the children as malicious liars, but as kids caught in a feedback loop of their own making, where the line between real fear and performed mystery became hopelessly blurred. The haunting, in this view, was a story they all told together until it became the only reality they knew. The crackling voice of Bill Wilkins, preserved on magnetic tape, has waited decades for a digital verdict. In recent years, audio forensic experts have turned their sophisticated software toward those infamous recordings, subjecting them to a level of scrutiny Maurice Grosse could never have imagined. Using spectral analysis and voiceprint technology, they can visualize the sound, breaking it down into its component frequencies and harmonics. Some of these modern analysts have pointed to a curious detail: the vocal characteristics of the Bill voice, particularly its fundamental frequency and resonance, appear in certain segments to be inconsistent with the undeveloped vocal cords of an 11-year-old girl. They suggest the voice possesses a complexity and a depth that would be extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, for a child to produce through mere acting or ventriloquism. This doesn't prove it's a dead man speaking, but it does raise a significant challenge to the simplest hoax theory. Could Janet have been a vocal prodigy, capable of a physiological feat that still puzzles experts with today's tools? Other re-evaluations look at the broader audio environment. Digital cleaning tools have been used to isolate the knocks and bangs from the background hiss of the old tapes, searching for patterns or inconsistencies that might suggest a human source. The entire case file, from witness statements to photographs, has been subjected to a new kind of crowd-sourced investigation online, with armchair detectives and professional skeptics debating every blurry shadow and contradictory report. This modern lens offers both clarity and confusion. High-resolution scans of the levitation photo can now be zoomed and enhanced, but they still cannot tell us what happened in that room. They only show us the grain of the film more clearly. So, does this arsenal of new technology finally solve the Enfield Poltergeist, or has it simply given us sharper tools to examine the same old, stubborn mystery? The digital age hasn't delivered a knockout punch, but it has refined the debate. It forces the hoax theory to become more sophisticated, to account for audio anomalies that seem to defy a child's capabilities. Conversely, it gives believers a new language of frequencies and waveforms to argue their case. We are left not with a verdict, but with a paradox. The more we examine the evidence, the more real and the more impossible it all seems. The haunting has evolved from a live event to a historical artifact, and like any artifact, its meaning changes with every new tool we use to study it. The debate over audio frequencies and digital analysis fades to a distant hum when we consider the people who lived it. For Janet and Margaret Hodgson, the poltergeist was not a case study, it was their childhood. When the phenomena finally ceased and the last reporter packed up his camera, The family was left in a profound silence, one filled not with peace, but with the echoing aftershocks of a 2-year nightmare. They returned to a world that had fundamentally changed because they had fundamentally changed. The intense, unrelenting scrutiny did not end with the haunting, it simply evolved. They became local legends, the ghost girls, carrying a stigma that followed them through school and into adulthood. Friends could be wary, neighbors curious in that intrusive way that feels more like an interrogation. Every strange noise in their own homes as adults would trigger a spike of primal fear, a conditioned response from years of living in a state of siege. The trauma was not just in the flying objects, but in the loss of their own narrative, the inability to tell their own story without it being dissected, doubted, or turned into entertainment. Janet, in particular, bore the heaviest burden as the primary focus. In later interviews, she has spoken with a weary clarity about the cost. She described the experience as utterly terrifying, a period of her life she would never wish on anyone. The media circus, she said, was almost as bad as the phenomena itself, stripping the family of privacy and dignity during their most vulnerable moments. Both sisters have remained unwavering in their core claim. Across decades, through documentaries and written accounts, their story has never materially changed. They insist with a quiet firmness that carries the weight of lived experience that they did not fake it. They acknowledge that as children under impossible pressure, there may have been moments where they exaggerated or played along, a desperate attempt to prove the unbelievable was happening to adults who seemed skeptical. But the foundation, the moving furniture, the voice, the levitation they maintain was horrifyingly real. This consistency is its own kind of evidence. A conspiracy maintained for a few months is one thing. A united story held for a lifetime by multiple people is another. Their reflections are not those of people cherishing a fun childhood prank, but of survivors trying to make sense of a profound rupture in their reality. The human cost of Enfield extends far beyond the broken crockery and scratched floorboards. It lives in the nervous glances, the inherited anxiety, and the simple, exhausting work of trying to build a normal life when your past is a question mark debated by millions. Their steadfast testimony forces us to ask one final, humbling question. If it was all a lie, why would they choose to carry its heavy weight for the rest of their lives? So we are left with a mountain of conflicting evidence. On one side, the case for a hoax seems built on solid human logic. There were those few, critical moments where the illusion seemed to slip. The reporter who found the pre-bent spoon, the accounts of Janet possibly being glimpsed throwing an object, the whispers from school friends about secret confessions. These are not trivial details, they are the cracks in the story, and they point directly to human hands. Then there is the figure of David Robertson, the neighbor and amateur magician. His presence is a gift to skeptics, a ready-made explanation for how two young girls could learn to throw a voice or stage a levitation. It paints a picture of a clever, long-term deception, a performance that spiraled far beyond its creator's original intentions. Above all, the hoax theory relies on a principle we all understand. People, especially children under stress, can lie, and they can lie very convincingly when they feel it serves a purpose. The desire for attention, the drama of a breaking story, the power of being at the center of a national mystery, these are powerful motivators. From this angle, Enfield is not a paranormal event, but a profound psychological and social one, a story a family told until it became their reality. Yet, standing opposite this is an equally formidable wall of evidence that simply refuses to crumble. Start with the police. Police Constable Carolyn Heaps had no stake in ghosts, no reason to file a false report. She was a trained observer doing her job, and she stated plainly she saw a chair move on its own. That testimony alone anchors the case in the realm of documented fact, not hearsay. Then consider the sheer, staggering volume of events. Over 2 years, there were thousands of reported incidents, from flying objects to disembodied voices to temperature drops. To sustain a hoax of that magnitude, involving multiple children without a single definitive, undeniable capture by the rotating teams of adults in the house, would require a level of coordination and secrecy that borders on the superhuman. The phenomena occurred in empty rooms in front of skeptical investigators actively trying to catch a fraud. They left physical traces like the trail of wet footprints with no wet children that are logistically baffling to fake. And finally, there are the conclusions of the men who lived there. Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair were not gullible tourists, they were seasoned investigators who arrived as skeptics. After months of direct daily observation, they became convinced not by one event, but by the relentless cumulative weight of the impossible. They staked their professional reputations on the authenticity of what they witnessed. So where does this leave us with the title's provocative claim, "The Hoax That Wasn't"? The evidence does not allow for a clean verdict. Instead, it forces us into a much more uncomfortable and perhaps more interesting space. This is not a binary choice between absolute truth and absolute lie. The most compelling interpretation of Enfield may live in the murky middle, a place where genuine, unexplained phenomena and human embellishment coexisted. Perhaps the initial, terrifying events were real, a psychic eruption or something else beyond our understanding. Then, under the blinding spotlight of media frenzy and constant investigation, the children, confused and desperate to be believed, began to supplement the real events with staged ones. The bent spoon, the thrown toy, these could be the tragic actions of kids trying to prove a truth that was, on its own, too strange to stand without help. In this light, Enfield is not a solved case but a profound human mystery. It is a story about the limits of perception, the power of belief, and the haunting possibility that sometimes the truth is not a single fact but a collision of realities where what is real and what is performed become forever intertwined. The house on Green Street may have been haunted not just by a ghost named Bill, but by our own desperate need to know for sure. Amidst the debate, certain events stand apart as stubborn, irreducible facts. These are incidents witnessed by multiple, independent observers under controlled conditions, moments that seem to slip through the fingers of even the most elegant hoax theory. The first is the phenomenon of synchronized knocking. It was not just the family who heard it. Investigators like Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair, along with visiting journalists and even a second police officer, all reported the same precise experience. They would be sitting in a quiet room, perhaps the living room, when a series of loud, distinct raps would emanate from the walls or furniture. The uncanny part was the intelligence behind them. The knocks would answer questions using a simple code, 1 rap for yes, 2 for no. A skeptic might argue a child could tap a hidden object, but here's the catch. The knocks would come from different locations in the room, sometimes from a wall behind an investigator or from the center of a table where no one was near. Multiple adults, all watching each other and the empty space, would hear the same sounds originating from the same impossible spot. This wasn't a secret trick in a crowded, chaotic moment. This was a controlled, repeatable demonstration of an invisible agency, verified by skeptical professionals who were actively trying to debunk it. The logistics of faking that day after day without a single collaborator ever revealing the method stretch credibility to its limit. Then there is the incident of the moving chair with Janet restrained. On one documented occasion, investigators were determined to rule out any possibility of Janet using her hands or feet to manipulate objects. They had her sit in the middle of the room, with an observer holding each of her hands and another watching her feet closely. Her limbs were accounted for and immobilized. While in this state, a chair several feet away from her reportedly slid across the floor. This event removes the simplest explanation of direct physical fraud. If Janet was the sole agent of the haunting, how did she move the chair while being physically held? The skeptic must then propose a conspiracy involving the investigators themselves, suggesting they were in on the hoax or were lying about their level of control. Yet these were men staking their professional reputations on the integrity of their report. The alternative is a hidden accomplice, perhaps a sibling, but that adds another layer of required secrecy and coordination in a house that was often filled with wary adults. This single, well-documented moment creates a logical knot that is very difficult to untie. Perhaps most baffling are the events involving knowledge. The voice of Bill Wilkins, as we've discussed, allegedly revealed specific details about the previous occupant's life and death. Investigators took these claims seriously enough to check local records and speak to old neighbors. They reportedly verified that an elderly man named Bill Wilkins had indeed died in the house, that he was blind at the end of his life, and that the cause of death was a hemorrhage in a chair downstairs. The question is, how would an 11-year-old girl access this obscure personal information? The hoax theory requires that Janet, or someone coaching her, conducted detailed local historical research without leaving a trace, all to seed a few lines of dialogue for a ghostly character. This presumes a level of foresight and meticulous planning that seems at odds with the spontaneous, chaotic nature of the rest of the phenomena. It feels like overkill for a childish prank. This verified knowledge sits like a pebble in the shoe of the skeptic's argument, a small, hard fact that refuses to be walked off. These incidents, the intelligent knocks, the movement under restraint, the verified personal knowledge, form a core of unexplained residue. They are the pieces that remain on the table after you've swept away the bent spoons and the media hysteria. You can explain away 90% of Enfield with psychology, pressure, and potential trickery, but this stubborn 10% refuses to dissolve. It suggests that at the very center of this 2-year storm, there was a kernel of genuine anomaly, something that interacted with the family, responded to questions, and displayed a chilling awareness of the past. This irreducible core is what transforms the Enfield Poltergeist from a simple ghost story or a proven fraud into a permanent historical mystery. It is the reason, decades later, we are still piecing it together, still listening to those crackling tapes, and still wondering what truly walked through that ordinary house on Green Street. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that both the believers and the skeptics might be asking the wrong questions entirely. What if the Enfield Poltergeist was not a ghost and not a hoax, but something else entirely, a symptom of the house itself, or the minds within it reacting to forces we rarely consider? Beyond the binary debate lies a shadowy landscape of alternative theories, each attempting to explain the unexplainable without invoking the supernatural. One of the most persistent ideas is that the entire household, and perhaps even the investigators who spent so much time there, fell victim to a form of shared psychosis. In medicine, this is sometimes called folie à famille, or madness of the family. It describes a situation where delusional beliefs and even physical sensations spread through a close-knit group, often beginning with one influential member. The initial, genuine fright over the moving furniture could have been the spark. In the heightened, fearful atmosphere that followed, every ordinary creak of the house settling, every draft under a door, could have been reinterpreted as part of the haunting. The children, looking to their terrified mother for cues, would have mirrored and amplified that fear. Their own exaggerated stories and reactions would then feed back to her, confirming the initial belief. This feedback loop, growing under the intense pressure of media scrutiny, could have created a shared reality so powerful that they all genuinely experienced the phenomena. They weren't lying, they were collectively hallucinating, their perceptions shaped by expectation and dread. This theory extends to the investigators as well. Maurice Grosse arrived hoping for evidence of life after death, spending night after night in that charged environment, listening to the family's stories, could have primed his own mind to interpret ambiguous events as paranormal. A chair leg settling on an uneven floor might become a deliberate slide. A random noise from the pipes might become an intelligent knock. This isn't to say they were weak or foolish, but that the human brain is a powerful pattern-making machine, especially under stress, and it can convince us of realities that do not exist outside our own heads. Then we must consider the possibility that the house itself was sick. Could there have been an environmental or geological factor silently warping the perceptions of everyone inside? One compelling candidate is infrasound, sound waves with a frequency lower than 20 Hz beneath the range of human hearing. You cannot hear infrasound, but you can feel it. It vibrates in your chest, it disturbs your inner ear, and it can induce profound feelings of anxiety, dread, and even the sensation of a presence in the room. Studies have shown that exposure to certain low-frequency sounds can cause people to see shadowy figures from the corner of their eye or feel an overwhelming sense of being watched. Sources of infrasound are surprisingly common, from industrial fans and traffic vibrations to natural geological shifts. If an underground water main near Green Street had a fault, or if the house's own structure resonated at a specific low frequency, it could have bathed the inhabitants in an invisible field of unease. This would explain the pervasive sense of dread, the cold spots which might be felt psychologically, and even the visual phenomena like shadowy movements. The flying objects and the voice, of course, would not be directly caused by sound waves, but the infrasound could have provided the psychological tinder, making the family hyper-suggestible and ready to interpret any normal event as part of a supernatural siege. Their stressed minds, agitated by this unseen force, might then have created the rest, either through unconscious psychokinesis or through conscious, desperate performance. The speculation stretches even further into the fringe. Some have wondered about electromagnetic fields from faulty wiring, which can also cause feelings of paranoia and visual disturbances. Others point to the history of the land itself, though no ancient burial ground was recorded there. A few even venture into the realm of interdimensional theory, suggesting the house sat on a temporary rift or thin spot where the rules of our reality briefly frayed. While these ideas are far less grounded, they speak to the profound mystery at the heart of Enfield. When faced with events that defy conventional explanation, the human imagination will race to fill the void, constructing frameworks that can be as strange as the phenomena they seek to explain. This breadth of speculation is itself a kind of evidence, proving that the case refuses to be solved by ordinary means. It pushes us to the edges of psychology, physics, and perception, asking us to consider that truth might be stranger than any single theory we can devise. By late 1978, the storm had begun to lose its force. The violent eruptions of flying objects became less frequent, the disembodied voice of Bill spoke more rarely, and the oppressive atmosphere in the house on Green Street slowly began to lift. It was not a sudden end, but a gradual fading, like a fever breaking after a long and terrible illness. By 1979, after nearly 2 years of relentless chaos, the Enfield Poltergeist was effectively over. The investigators packed away their tape recorders and cameras. The reporters finally found other stories, and the Hodgson family was left to piece together a life in the quiet. But why did it stop? The answer to that question may be as revealing as the phenomena themselves, pointing toward the true nature of the haunting. One of the most compelling explanations aligns perfectly with the recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis theory. Janet Hodgson was entering her teenage years as the activity peaked. Poltergeist cases worldwide have shown a startling correlation with adolescence, often ceasing when the young person at the center passes through this turbulent developmental stage. If the phenomena were an unconscious psychic eruption fueled by the intense emotional and hormonal energy of puberty, then its end makes a grim kind of sense. As Janet's body and mind settled into a new equilibrium, the vast, chaotic energy that had been spilling out into the physical world simply subsided. The pressure valve closed. This theory frames the haunting not as an external invasion, but as a biological and psychological event with a natural lifespan, tied directly to the maturation of one girl. Another possibility is that the family and even the phenomena itself became acclimatized. For 2 years, they lived in a state of constant hypervigilance. Eventually, even terror can become routine. The shock value of a moving chair or a flying cup wears off when you have seen it 100 times. This normalization might have drained the events of their power. If, as some psychological theories suggest, the chaos served as a dysfunctional cry for attention or a release for family stress, then the mere fact of being witnessed and believed by so many authorities could have fulfilled that unconscious need. The purpose was served. The haunting had achieved what it set out to do, even if that purpose was never consciously understood by the family themselves. There is also the simple, eerie idea that the energy just ran out. Whether you view it as a spiritual presence, a psychic battery, or a temporary glitch in reality, the force behind Enfield may have had a finite reserve. After 2 years of expending itself in knocks, throws, and voices, it simply dissipated, exhausted. This notion of a haunting with a limited lifespan appears in folklore and case studies throughout history, suggesting some disturbances are not permanent, but events that burn brightly and then fade away. The cessation is a crucial, often overlooked chapter in the narrative. A haunting that never ends becomes a legend, but a haunting that stops becomes a case study. Its finite nature invites us to diagnose it, to look for causes and effects within a closed system. The fact that it faded not with a dramatic exorcism, but with the quiet passing of time, lends a strange credibility to the whole affair. It feels less like a story with a written ending, and more like a natural phenomenon that we simply observed until its conclusion. The silence that finally fell over number 284 Green Street was the last and perhaps most profound piece of evidence. It asks us what truly lived in that house and why, after all that noise, it finally decided to leave. The silence that fell over Green Street did not end the story, it sealed its place in history. The Enfield Poltergeist is no longer just a case file. It has become the archetype, the measuring stick for every modern haunting that followed. In the world of paranormal investigation, Enfield is the Everest, the event against which all other poltergeist claims are compared and often found wanting. Its sheer scale is unmatched. 2 years of documented phenomena, police verification, media saturation, and intensive study by serious researchers. Before Enfield, ghost stories were often fleeting tales from lonely country houses. After Enfield, the haunting entered the suburban living room, complete with tape recorders, skeptical psychologists, and tabloid headlines. It professionalized the paranormal, forcing a messy, chaotic human drama into a framework of evidence collection. For parapsychology, the case was both a pinnacle and a poison pill. It provided the single richest trove of first-hand witness testimony, audio recordings, and photographic evidence ever gathered in a single location. Researchers could point to the police report, the hours of Morris Gross's tapes, the sworn statements, and say, look, this demands an explanation beyond simple fraud. Yet, the very publicity and controversy surrounding Enfield also tainted the field. The media circus and the persistent allegations of hoax made it a lightning rod for ridicule, allowing mainstream science to dismiss the entire discipline by focusing on the case's most problematic elements. Enfield became the reason to believe and the reason to scoff all at once. Culturally, it embedded itself deep in our collective imagination. It directly inspired frightening films and television series, shaping how an entire generation visualizes a haunting, not with ethereal specters, but with flying furniture, disembodied voices, and ordinary families under siege. The case tapped into a fundamental human fascination, the desire to peek behind the curtain of reality, to wonder if the world is stranger and more mysterious than our daily lives suggest. Enfield offered that possibility not as a dusty legend, but as a contemporary event happening to people who could have been our neighbors. This is why, decades later, the debate rages with undiminished ferocity. New documentaries are made, books are reanalyzed, and online forums dissect every grainy frame and audio clip. The evidence is all out there, a vast, contradictory puzzle left for us to solve. We keep returning to Enfield because it is the perfect mystery, one that refuses to be categorized. It sits precisely at the crossroads of every possible explanation, a ghost story for the skeptic, a case study for the psychologist, and a permanent question mark for anyone who wonders what is truly possible in the quiet houses of our world. So we find ourselves back at the beginning, standing outside that ordinary semi-detached house on a quiet London street. The journey through the eerie halls of 284 Green Street has taken us from a sliding chest of drawers to a voice from beyond the grave, from a photograph of a levitating girl to a trail of wet footprints with no owner. We have sat with the terrified family, walked alongside the determined investigators, and listened to the sharp critiques of the skeptics. The Enfield Poltergeist is not a simple ghost story. It is a complex, tangled tapestry woven from threads of chilling first-hand testimony, stubbornly puzzling physical evidence, the credible accounts of police officers and researchers, and the entirely legitimate, piercing questions of rational doubt. Each thread is strong on its own, yet when pulled together, they create a picture that refuses to come into a single, clear focus. No theory, no matter how elegant, seems to cover every single strange occurrence within those walls. The paranormal explanation leaves us grappling with forces that defy our understanding of physics. The grand hoax theory demands a performance of superhuman consistency and secrecy from children. The psychological interpretation asks us to accept a power of the mind that borders on the miraculous. This is why the case endures decade after decade. It presents us with a mystery that has all the evidence of a solution, yet none of the closure. It may forever remain exactly what we called it at the start, the hoax that was not a hoax, a permanent question mark in the annals of the unexplained. The file is closed, but the debate is very much alive, so now we turn the final question over to you. After walking through all the evidence, hearing the voices, and weighing the arguments, where does your belief settle? Do you hear the rasp of a dead man on those old tapes, or the clever act of a troubled girl? Do you see a child floating in defiance of gravity, or a trick of light and expectation frozen on film? The truth of Enfield is now yours to decide. Share your verdict in the comments below, and if you crave more journeys into the shadows of history's greatest puzzles, be sure to subscribe. Our next deep dive into the unknown is already waiting.